If you remember when I put the fuel tank in, and I told you, or excuse me, when I put the fuel pump in and I spun it to push it in the rest of the way, I said be careful that the float and pickup sock on this does not hit the float for the fuel gauge. The fuel gauge simply has a wire with a float on the end of it that comes up and down and indicates in this strange little configuration that Honda came up with, where you never remember if red is fuel or white is fuel, so you're not really sure what it means. At any rate, that's their idea of a fuel gauge. I'm not sure what happened to the simple E and F and a needle, but we need to change the fuel gauge so that there is no way that that arm can hit the float on the fuel pickup. In order to remove the fuel gauge, pull the decal off. And it'll reveal two Phillips head screws. We'll set the decal off the side for right now. We'll remove these two Phillips head screws. Now, if you look into the top of the fuel tank, you'll be able to see the arm for the stock fuel float, and it swings around and just barely misses my float on this particular generator. However, there exists a strong possibility of it hitting, and any possibility whatsoever is just too much. There are two ways of correcting this, and I'll do the way that I prefer first. The way I prefer is you pull the fuel gauge out and you simply spin it around so that the wiper arm faces the back of the fuel tank. Slide it forward, and if you lift up on this little red plastic, and you can see that there's a lot of play in it, which is why it'll allow it to flex around and possibly hit my float. Worst case scenario is it lands on top of my float and somehow gets bound up so it holds my float in the down position. Then my system thinks that the tank is empty and it continues to transfer fuel. Worst case scenario. But you would put it in and simply put the screws back in and tighten them down. However, if you have looked at the video and realized that it's only 3.5 hours long and you're wondering what else you're going to do for the rest of the day, you can take, and you'll notice that there's a Z-bend in this rod. The bottom Z-bend, I'll hold it at this angle, here's your Z-shaped bend. This one here, if you bend it to where it is halfway between where it is and straight out, and then slide it in and look down into the tank, you'll see that the float should be clearing my float. If there's any doubt that it clears, unsnap this cover, take the glass out of the way. Then you've got this slight piece of red plastic that they use as their indicator. Pull that back. And make sure that the float travels the full range of motion. So now the float is over here, well away from the stock, or excuse me, well away from the fuel pump and my float and the pickup sock and so forth. However, this is kind of a pain to get in there, and the other fact is I'm just not happy with their fuel gauge because it's always confusing when you look at it. to know whether or not it was half full or all the way full, because you can't remember whether red was full fuel or white was fuel or whatever. If you have the time to do this and the patience, it worked out perfect for me the first time I did, but you know how it goes when you're doing it yourself. You're going to have to do it 6 or 8 times to get the sweet spot. But like I say, halfway between where they've got it bent and straight out with the Z-bend of the rod, so you go about like here and it'll match. I still strongly prefer just swinging it around and facing it backward. When you face it backward, the fuel gauge will not be accurate. I say that like it ever was accurate. I'm not real impressed with the gauge in the first place. But at any rate, I favor pointing the float backward if you'd prefer to do it this way. Either way, you've eliminated any possibility of the float on the fuel gauge from hitting the float on the transfer pump. Then you'd simply put the screws back in. And then put the decal back into place. So if you elected to bend the float, you'll want the little gas pump icon to be facing the front of the generator, but if you spun the float assembly around backward, you'd want the little gas pump icon to be back here. But with the shape of the fuel tank, when you face it to the rear, it's no longer accurate. Not that it ever truly was.